governments and private corporations. Last fall, the Stuxnet worm sabotaged Iran's nuclear program. In April, hackers hit Sony, exposing the personal data of 100 million customers. Defense contractor Lockheed Martin was targeted in May. And soon after that, Citigroup reported thousands of its U.S. accounts had been hacked. Joining us now to discuss the growing threat of cyber warfare is former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff. He is now chairman of the Chertoff Group, a global security consulting firm. Welcome to the show.
Good to be on the show.
Thanks so much for stopping by. When you look, given all of these recent attacks, when you look at our nation's infrastructure, where do you see the biggest vulnerabilities when it comes to cybersecurity?
The biggest vulnerability comes when your networks are connected to a lot of other networks, because basically the weakest link in the chain brings everybody into jeopardy. So when you have highly complicated networks, whether it's in the financial area or the power area, you've got to be careful that everybody you're connected with, including the people in your own organization, have a robust cybersecurity capability.
Your job is to sort of look at the landscape and think about worst-case scenarios. What are the worst-case scenarios when it comes to cyber attacks?
I think the thing people worry the most about is the possibility of an attack on an industrial control system or on a network itself that would result in destroying or damaging the network or corrupting the information. For example, a financial services firm which had its data corrupted in a way that made it untrustworthy. On the other hand, putting aside the extreme case, every day, day in and day out, we have huge amounts of data, intellectual property being stolen, much of it being exported overseas. And that's a real present threat. It's not a hypothetical threat. And it's costing us billions of dollars in terms of our economic position in the world.
A recent report from 13 different U.S. intelligence agencies found that China is using cyber espionage as an economic tool, stealing ideas and intellectual property at what they say is an alarming rate. Where do you see the biggest threats coming from globally? Is it China?
Well, the threats are coming from nation states, and this report singles out China and Russia as locations where we're seeing a lot of activity, but it can also come from non-state actors and from business competitors. And the economic impact is real. It's costing jobs because the research and development we do and we spend money on winds up getting stolen so our competitors can get the jump on us. And that's a big problem.
And you actually believe it's not just international places that there is a threat, that employees inside U.S. companies are also a threat. How so?
Here's what you have to realize. Although there is a technical element to dealing with this problem, it's also about human beings. Human beings who either by mistake or through negligence or even willful misconduct do things that introduce malware or malicious content into the network. You know, a great example of this is people who pick up a thumb drive that they find somewhere and stick it into their computer, which to my mind is akin to walking down the street, finding a piece of food on the sidewalk and sticking it in your mouth. It's crazy, and yet that kind of activity has caused some of the most serious cybersecurity breaches in our history.
So the question is then what to do. You wrote a column in the Washington Post with Jay Rockefeller saying managing cybersecurity risk has always been and will always be in large part a private sector responsibility. Simply put, it is a cost of doing business in the 21st century. How much responsibility does the government bear versus private companies in cyberspace?
I think there's a lot the government does and can do, but I think most of us believe that since the assets and the networks are largely in private hands, you really want to have the private sector pulling most of the laboring oar here. We don't necessarily want to have the U.S. government sitting on everybody's network watching everybody's traffic. But that means the private sector has to step up to the plate, and they have to be willing to invest the time and the effort and even the money to introduce a real measure of cybersecurity into their networks.
What about privacy?
Well, here's the thing. You can't have privacy without security. If I make a promise to you that I'm going to keep your data private, but I don't have the ability to police my own network, then my promise is worthless. And so my argument is you can't have privacy if you don't have robust security.
Do social networks and all of the activity happening on mobile devices, does that all make us more vulnerable?
Well, remember, we're talking about networks, so whatever can find its way in the network can attack the network. when you use mobile devices that don't have adequate security, when you sit in your office and use your office computer to do social network activity, and you're bringing in things that are dangerous or malicious, you're compromising the network. So you've got to separate between what you do recreationally and what you introduce into areas where you have really serious security issues.
Now, you're in town because you're actually opening a new office here in San Francisco. Why do you think it's important to have a team in the Bay Area where all of these tech companies are based?
Well, precisely because so much of the innovation and the ingenuity is coming out of Silicon Valley. And the idea is to get it in connection with what's going on in government, because there's really a mutual benefit here. The innovation and the invention comes here, but the requirements and the needs and some of the legal architecture comes out of Washington. So we think we can be a bridge between what's going on here in California and what's going on back in Washington.
And what are the companies here telling you about what their concerns are?
You know, I'd say as compared to 5 years ago when I talked about cybersecurity and people weren't very interested, everybody realizes now it's a big deal. First of all, their own networks and their own intellectual property are at stake. And also they realize there's a real market for this because, as you described earlier, there have been a lot of intrusions. So what they're telling us is we need to understand the government, and the government needs to understand us. They can't Bigfoot us or try to treat us like a large defense contractor. And it's in that space that we're finding some real opportunities.
Former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff, thanks for joining us here
Thanks for having us.
on Bloomberg West.